He fell in love with her, and he never guessed the cost. Night had settled like an oil stain over the coastal road. Thick, slow, impossible to push off. Street lamps blinked in a line, their yellow a little drunk. 5 men laughed too loud inside a stolen pickup, bottle glass chiming like tiny bells. The ocean beyond the dunes breathed a steady, indifferent breath. Insects tuned themselves into a single, low hum. Jordan sat behind the wheel, his knee pressed against the gear shift, eyes rinsed with whiskey, voice loose with the bravado of the unpunished. Around him, Kelvin cracked jokes that landed harder than they meant to. Marcus dared Samuel into another round of bets. David filmed the silliness on a shaky phone while someone played a skipping song on a borrowed speaker. They were young enough to think the night belonged to them. They were drunk enough to prove it. They saw the snake only because Kelvin's flashlight caught a flash of black against the gravel. It coiled like a question mark under the car's undercarriage, a living rope, the clean curve of its neck catching faint lamplight. For a flicker of sober thinking, a sober moment among the bottles. Someone whispered to leave it, to let it be. The whisper was swallowed by laughter. Jordan, trembling with a misplaced sort of courage, stepped down from the truck. He meant no lesson, no cruelty. In the clumsy geometry of alcohol, the cobra was simply another thing to conquer. He shone the light into its face. For a second, the snake's head lifted as if to nod. It had eyes the color of wet coal. Jordan laughed, and then he urinated against the tire, an instinctive, sloppy mockery of territory. And that foolish, careless motion was the last human thing he would do that hour. Someone kicked at it. Stones joined the ritual. Bottles cracked against the asphalt. The snake uncoiled in a blurred streak, and the men, who had never been taught how to meet a wild creature other than to belittle it, threw their weight at it. There was a scuffle of bodies and hissing. The animal's tongue sampled air like a priest tasting wine, and then a lance of panic. It twisted beneath boot, and boot met bone with a dull, final sound. The victory was immediate and ridiculous. Someone cheered. Someone took a fistful of gravel and scattered it back into the road as if to bury bad luck. They climbed back into the truck, louder now, the night congratulating them. They did not notice the second, smaller movement, a ripple at the edges of their vision. 2 watchers in the long grass, coiling away into shadow. Only when the truck rattled and ate the dark road did something settle. A thin, wrong silence. The men whooped until their throats dried, and then fell into a worn sort of stupor. Jordan thought about the snake once, the way men thought about small cruelties. A warm hand on a moment already cooling. He did not know one of those watchers had followed him. If you want to keep listening, if this beginning already has you leaning forward, subscribe now. But only if you promise to stay until the end of this night. By dawn the air grew thin and honest, the sky a pale bruise that cleared as the sun rose. Jordan stumbled out of the truck at his gate, the sand crunching beneath his sandals like burnt paper. He had the grin of someone who had survived a stakeout against fate and won by distraction. He did not look beneath his seat. The thing that slipped out from under the truck was small and deliberate. It smelled faintly of river clay and something older. It slid across Jordan's shoe and, with an almost tender patience, drew itself along the threshold of his life, and into the first weak warmth that looked like shelter. Where you might have expected scales and venom, the morning found instead a young woman on his doorstep, one of those impossible mornings when light finds a way to smooth hard edges. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, hair clipped back, eyes steady as if she had been waiting. Her skin held a peculiar translucence, the sort that made the sun bless the smallest plane of flesh like glass. When she smiled, Jordan felt abrupt bleeding tenderness, a sudden ridiculous wish to protect someone who asked nothing of him. She did not speak at first. She let him speak the clumsy card-table questions men ask when something bright appears in their doorframe. He fumbled for explanations. Did she need water? A place? Help? And she only tilted her head and watched, the way a bird watches a hand move toward a feeder. When fear finally rose, it was not even his. It was the shape of the town's superstitions curling up, soft and quick. He saw her, a real, breathing woman, and the image of the snake he and his friends had killed slid like a film beneath his mind. He told himself she could be a mend, a stranger, a rumor come to flesh. He offered her coffee. She accepted, and in the small domesticity of poured sugar and clinking mugs, she smiled in ways that undermined his remaining caution. Her name was Diana, she said at last, as if introducing herself at a wake. Her voice was a thin, clear thing, smoky, not because she was broken, but because she had seen nights that measured time in other rhythms. She sat as if she belonged at Jordan's small table, and did not flinch when his neighbor peered in and asked if everything was all right. There were small things he noticed as the day unfolded. A coolness to her hand that made his skin prickle like a phone touched to a sleeping ear. The uncanny stillness about her when the television droned on. A few flakes, tiny, glassy scales, on the hem of her sleeve that caught the light and made it look like a spritz of stars. Jordan bent to brush them away, and found his fingertips brushed a dryness that cracked like riverbed. Fear made a careless man clumsy. He pulled her closer with a courtesy made of curiosity and pity, and the odd human habit of trying to own small dangers by naming them. She let him. She sat in his living room and laughed at his jokes in the exact place he wanted a woman to laugh. Softly, in a way that made him think of being young and untethered. By evening, she had a place on his couch. By midnight, she was a figure moving through his kitchen like a thought that had finally been given a body. The next day, Kelvin's phone stopped answering. Weeks have a way of compressing themselves where grief is concerned. Time snaps like twine. Kelvin did not die with drums or prayer. His end was the clean, precise thing of the world when it chooses to stop. He was found in his bed, peacefully reclined as if he had merely fallen asleep. The mark on his throat was 2 small dark dots, arranged like the punctuation of an accusation, stabbed faintly into the skin at the base of his skull. There were no signs of struggle, and the room smelled faintly of river clay. At the funeral, Jordan watched bodies in black move like fish over a reef. He watched Marcus stand too close to Samuel and say the wrong things. He watched David study a photograph of Kelvin and look older than his years. The 2 dots whispered across their faces like an old superstition revealed too late. The pattern repeated itself in Kelvin, and then again in Samuel, and then in Marcus. Each death followed the same quiet timetable, one morning's living, one evening's silence, and each was announced to the town by the same 2 black marks and the strange hush that followed as if someone had pressed the world's lips shut. Jordan found himself at graves more often than not. He lit a match for Kelvin and felt the flame tug something inside him loose. He should have been furious. Some part of him wanted to pound on the dead men who had killed the snake, to pull them out of their houses and hold their faces to the wrongness. But grief is more slippery than that. It faded into a hollow that couldn't be fixed by anger, a place where the smallest kindnesses become beacons. Diana fit those beacons with an ease that unsettled him. She learned the mundane architecture of his life as if she had sifted through it for a purpose. She made coffee at dawn without asking. She folded his shirts the way a lover folds the world to make it smaller and safe. She sat with him at the wake, and though she did not cry in the way people expected, her presence felt like an apology the universe had finally offered him. Jordan accepted this apology the way a thirsty man accepts rain. You could say love is a thing that happens when 2 people are porous. Wounds leak into each other, and one heals by the same warmth that makes the other burn. Jordan's armor had already been picked away by guilt and the weight of being the one who'd been there when the snake died. He had been careless. Perhaps in a corner he believed he deserved some of the silence that had settled over his friends. Diana did not ask questions. She listened. When he confessed, late one night, that he had peed on the snake, and that the memory haunted him like an itch, she only reached for his hand and threaded her fingers between his. The touch was cold, but her fingers curled around his like a vow. It felt, to him, like absolution. She was not simply a comfort. She was calculated as well. When Kelvin's funeral was still damp, Jordan found one of Diana's tiny glassy flakes lodged in the fold of his t-shirt, as if she had been there and left a fingerprint. Once, standing under the small balcony of his room when the moon silvered the tiles, he saw the flash of a tongue that was not human, and then, immediately, a woman's face, composing itself into contrition. At times, she watched him with the patience of a predator. At others, she watched him as if memorizing the rhythm of his sleep. Grief makes companions move faster toward attachment than sobriety ever would. Jordan's nights, once hollow with rum and reckless bravado, filled with conversation that was small at first, and then tectonic. She listened to the story of his mother's hands, and told him the story of her own, speaking in fragments that never quite added up. He told her about his father's absence, the empty chair at dinner, the nights he had played football with no shoes. She told him of rivers that fold into themselves, and the names of trees that people forget in city life. She fed him melon slices at 3 a.m. She hummed a tune that lodged itself in his throat and would come back when he washed dishes, or when the town's children shouted in the street. Her laugh began to mean something more than simple amusement. It became a refuge, and while he softened, the town hardened. People drew lines the way children draw hopscotch. They kept their distance and kept their eyes open. The pastor muttered words about consequences and asked for prayers at the church door. Rumors gathered like moths in the rafters. Someone whispered that the dead had been punished for a vice, that some old law had been invoked and settled. But for Jordan, wrapped in the warmth of Diana's small attentions, those whispers were background noise, like television static. He had found safety in a woman's palm, and safety is a profound narcotic. At the same time, outside the rooms where grief grew and he softened, the night was thinking in lines older than whispers. The snake people, if that is what they could be called, moved in a different register entirely. They kept councils in the places where the town's light could not find them. The river's mouth when it breathed salt and mud. The low, dark cemetery where roots knotted like old fingers through bones. Diana would sometimes leave at dawn and return before the town had fully opened its eyes. When she left, she did not walk like a woman leaving a house. She folded into the world like a piece of shadow slipping beneath a door. There were moments that felt like dreams then turned real. Once, Jordan found her at the river before the sun had woken the water. She stood barefoot in the silt, palms cupped around an egg the size of a cocoa fruit. When he asked about it, she only said, "We keep what we are." She turned and her shadow seemed longer than the girl standing there. In the nights that followed Kelvin's death, the killings kept their silent cadence. Samuel's absence came like a missing chord, sudden, devastating. Marcus followed. David came close, but did not fall. Each corpse, when the town finally allowed the word corpse to be named, bore the same punctuation, the same 2 tiny ebony dots set like eyes at the base of the skull. The pattern bound the tragedies together in a way the authorities could not untangle. The police scribbled notes and called on old wives' tales with embarrassed lips. They found no weapon, no poison traceable to a label, only the stubborn geometry of 2 dots that gleamed like a shared secret. Jordan began keeping vigil in a different way. He walked the lanes at midnight, looked for footprints in the dust, counted the holes in fences for signs of passage. He stared at Diana when she slept, and traced the slope of her jaw as if memorizing a map that might help him later. He wanted clarity more than revenge. He wanted confession. When he looked at Diana, he often found she was already watching him, her eyes calm, as if she had been there waiting for him to understand. And then, at the slow middle of the night when the town's breathing slowed to a single cadence, Diana showed him a mark. They were alone in his house. The funeral wreath sat against the wall like a tide mark. He had drunk too much and lay with his head heavy on the sofa, as if planks of night had been laid across his chest. Diana knelt beside him, and with a tenderness that made him think of all the things he had ever wanted, she brushed back his hair. The gesture was intimate and ordinary, and it made something in him cave toward her. Her thumb traced lightly over the back of his neck, and when she pulled away, his skin was marked. The same 2 dark dots, no larger than freckles, perfectly aligned where the hair met the skin. He jerked up, but she only watched him with that unblinking patience. "It is nothing," she said, a soft lie, if it was a lie at all. "A token," she added, and the word in her mouth was more ritual than consolation. He tried to think of rational things. Maybe he'd rubbed against something in the night. Maybe it was ink from a pen that had leaked. Maybe he was seeing shadows. But the mark warmed against the underlining warmth of his skin in a way that made his stomach fold over itself. He touched the dots with one trembling finger. The texture was wrong. It did not feel like skin, not exactly. It felt like a pressed imprint from some tool made in the dark. Fear is a slow tutor. It teaches you in small increments until you cannot deny its subject line. Jordan watched Diana, pulling for confessions with the greedy curiosity of a man trying to prove a half-belief. She gave him pieces of stories, of nights when she had crawled through reeds and swallowed the taste of iron in the dark, of a mother who shaped law with her mouth, of oaths taken on river stones. When asked why her hand had left those marks, she only said, with an undeniable regret that pinched her face, "We have a language older than your people. We keep accounts. We keep balance." He wanted to believe her. He wanted, in the brittle corners of his heart where loneliness had made roots, to let her teach him what balance looked like. He wanted to be forgiven because forgiveness buys a man's softness against guilt. That softness is a tidal thing. It sweeps all reason away on a night when the sea is kind. But the town's bodies kept piling up like a bad season of weather. The two dots multiplied quietly, and the silence that followed the deaths made Jordan uneasy in ways that sleep could not mend. He began to sense things at the edge of his sight, a flash of scales reflected in a spoon, a half-memory of a tongue that did something other than taste. He would ask Diana direct questions. "Who are you, really?" And she would look at him as if he had asked about the weather. "Who I was," she would say, "is not all I can be." Between those answers she would fold like a living question, retreating into old habits that felt like ritual. Once, in the night between Marcus's funeral and the third wake, she left and did not return until dawn. When she came back, her palms had the faint smell of smoked fish and riverweed. She sat at his side in the pale kitchen light and simply touched his knee. And something in him, the part that kept counting the cost, gave up. At length she revealed, without speaking the word he wanted to hear, that there were rules. In a dream, she told him fragments, a council that met under a silvering moon, a mother who wore her age like an iron collar and whose voice carried the authority of river stones pressed together for centuries. Diana's eyes would darken when she spoke of her mother, and in those depths Jordan saw something like an edict. "She keeps the ledger," Diana said once, and the syllables felt like a verdict. The ledger demanded its ledger keeper. One evening, when the town smelled of rubber burn and frying oil, and the world had tired of pretending nothing had changed, the mother came. Diana had disappeared into the mangrove the week after Marcus's funeral. Jordan followed, as one follows a fever into the body it seeks to claim, into the tangled roots and low, reeking water where the town's fishermen refused to stray after sunset. The forest there held a different language. The trees leaned in on you like listeners. Shadows under the boughs spoke in the hush of their rubbing. He found them gathered by the river's lip, two figures at the center of a ring made of roots and mud. The older woman, no, the mother, sat with the gravity of a reef. Her skin had the color of river tannin, and her hair was less hair than a crown of black vines threaded with tiny white bones. She wore a cloak that glinted where scales would. Her face had the not-quite-human stillness of a dream you remember too clearly. Careworn, spared, and unafraid. When she looked upon Jordan she did so with the measured curiosity one might have when a child finds a strange stone in the sand. Diana knelt before her with a humility Jordan had never seen. The mother's voice was thin, brittle as wire, and it carried something older than law. A history of hurt, a ledger long maintained and never balanced. "You have been given warmth," she intoned to Diana, and the word warmth landed in the air like the first heat after rain. "You have made choice. There are debts. Debts must be closed." Jordan stepped forward then, driven by a need for answers that felt like a hand under his ribs. He wanted to claim Diana, to rip apart the ritual in front of him with a fistful of modern noise and demand a simple human explanation. When he opened his mouth, the mother turned to him, and the look she gave was not one you return for long. "You were there," she said, and her voice flattened time. "You measured life by amusement. You threw a stone and a life was broken. The world has her scales, and we keep balance," Jordan wanted to explain. He wanted to say all the things it takes to round up an apology. The slurred jokes, the bottles, the feeling of being a boy again. The mother did not let him talk. Her eyes slid past him to Diana, and in that look there was no tenderness. "Within 3 days," she said, and the words dropped like coins into a deep well. "He must be returned. The ledger will not excuse. Diana's face was a map of lace. For a moment she seemed to fracture. Something like a hiss came from her throat when the mother pronounced the ultimatum. She leaned forward and buried her face in her hands, and Jordan heard, like a small animal, something wholly human trembling through her ribs, a sob wrapped in scales. "Please," she mouthed without sound, then looked at the mother as if asking whether the ledger could be rewritten. The mother's answer was as immovable as a cliff. 3 days, she repeated. Her voice was warm with finality. If within 3 days the account is not balanced, then the punishment shall fall on you. Diana's head rose slowly. Her eyes met Jordan's, and the air between them was a taut string. He wanted to move, to protect, to bargain. She took his hand. It was cold and shaking. She said nothing about how she would keep him from herself, about how her hands had already left marks that would divide their nights like a seam. She only touched him as if to steady him, and in so doing, made him more dependent. He could not understand then what the mother had meant by returned. He could not imagine the ledger containing the messy consequences of human carelessness and the precise calculus of a species that balanced life with life. He could not have known that the 2-dot mark was not a mere symbol, but a stamp of something older, a signature of a policy the river people recorded with an intimacy the town could not grasp. For Diana, the ultimatum cleaved something inside her as clean as a blade. She had, in the slow craft of her infiltration, begun to feel that the human world arranged itself around a possibility of love she had not expected. There were moments she would wake with Jordan's breath in her ear and think, impossibly, that if she could disappear into his life permanently, no more councils, no more rituals, then perhaps she could keep his other friends from ever being reduced to marks and hushes. Love, in her, was not a sudden flame, but a subterranean warmth that softened the old scales. It complicated the work she had been raised for. She had been raised to be a ledger-keeper's arm. She had been taught to count with teeth and patience. She had been taught to avenge. She had been taught that the past was not forgiven until it was recompensed. Her mother's words, 3 days, were a timetable for the storm. She would have to choose where the ledger's ink went, upon the man who had started this whole unholy calculus, or upon her own head as a penance for failing to keep her people's law. When Jordan came home that evening, the house smelled of riverweed and something crisp he could not name. Diana had lit a small lamp and laid out food like a treaty. She stood at the doorway, hands clasped, and the 3 words she had not been allowed to say by anyone other than the river were there, jagged and half-formed in her chest. "I do not want to." "You have 3 days," Jordan finally heard himself say, the words thin with disbelief, as if by declaring them aloud he could shrink their brutality. He did not know what he wished for more: to bargain with the mother, to erase the mark from his neck, to have the town forget its debts and live with a better kind of unaccounted love. Diana's hand found his and squeezed, a gesture so small it could have been mistaken for reassurance. Her mouth opened and closed. She swallowed and said, "I will try." That was the last phrase for a while that told no lie and yet carried none of the truth. She would try. To whom and at what cost, the ledger would decide. 3 days is a small thing, and an enormous one. In 3 days the town might move on, or the ledger might insist on its balance. In 3 days the mother's shadow would grow or shrink. In 3 days Jordan's secret would either be paid, or it would stain the one thing he had been given to survive: Diana's tenderness. When night fell, Diana stood at the gate and watched the road where the streetlights bled into a thin ribbon. Her silhouette was small against the wide dark. Her fingers were on the gate's handle, a question of motion. Jordan watched her from the doorway and saw the tremor inside that hand. The war between what she had been taught to do and whatever new thing had lodged inside her ribs. He had no idea then that the ledger and love were 2 different kinds of hunger, each with its own law and its own cruelty. The world breathed in and held it. The river murmured somewhere beyond the fence. The town slept for now, unaware of the hourglass that had just been turned. And Diana, whose skin caught the streetlight in shards, stood with the weight of an ancient obligation across her shoulders and a softer, more dangerous thing nesting in her chest. She placed her palm on the iron and pushed. If you want to know whether love wins, whether a ledger forgives, whether the marks will spread or be erased, keep watching. To see what Diana chooses, subscribe and return for the next part. The gate moved with a scrape like a small animal shifting in the dark. Diana let it close behind her and did not turn. Jordan watched the pale sweep of her back, the way the lamplight picked out something like glass in the hollow of her shoulder. He felt the hour press into him, the ledger's coins striking wood. And for the first time the town's small superstitions felt enormous and true. They spoke in the doorway until 3 in the morning. Words that skirted confession and landed on the shapes of things instead. Diana told him of the river mouths and the names that the old women kept in their hands. She told him, in fragments, how the mother's voice could wrench a night into order. Jordan listened and tried to stitch the fragments into something human. He learned how to press his palm to her hand until it warmed. He learned to say useless sentences. "Hold on, we'll find a way," because speech itself felt like currency. On the first morning light after the ultimatum, the town looked like it had been sanded down. There were more people at the market, more eyes. David moved like someone who had a camera full of guilt. Sometimes Jordan caught him at the edge of the street, hands in his pockets, watching too intently the house where Diana made coffee and folded shirts. The police came once with a report that was mostly formalities. The pastor moved through town with a softer voice, as if he had been handed a problem that prayer could not wrap in neat ribbons. Nothing they did changed the shape of those 3 words. 3 days. On the second day, Diana stopped sleeping for any length of time. She moved through errands with a movement that had the economy of a creature conserving heat. Once or twice, when Jordan asked her to rest, she laughed, a small brittle noise, and said, "There is no rest to bargain with." She spent hours wandering the mangrove edges where the mud licked at bare ankles and the roots tangled like the fingers of old mothers. She met no one but the river's slow traffic, a crab dragging a shell, a cat with damp whiskers, fishermen who looked at her and pretended not to know her. The mother did not wait. She came to Diana by night in a way that had the inevitability of tide. It was not a boastful arrival. She simply appeared where Diana sat among roots, as if her body had always been a hollow in the bank. Diana bowed her head, and the mother's shadow fell across her shoulders like a wet cloth. "You would bargain with warmth," the mother said. Her voice was the scrape of reed in winter. "You would barter a child's heart for a soft life." "I would not barter him," Diana said. "I would give—" She stopped, because there were no words in their ledger for what she meant to offer. "He is the coin thrown in jest," the mother answered, "and we balance for the coin." She tilted her head. The lines around her mouth made maps Jordan could not read. "You knew the law. You knew the sum." "I was raised to be loyal," Diana said. "I was taught to mend the scales, but I was not taught how to love a human the way I do now." The mother watched her for a long time. In that watch there was a history of winters, debts paid, stories settled, old wrongs measured with teeth. "Love is not a currency for debts," she said finally. "But love can be evidence of choice. You may offer yourself. Some ledgers accept substitution. Some remain unbending. You would be returned and erased. You would know the river again in a way that is not the same." Diana's throat worked. She had not meant, once, to build a life with Jordan. She had come cold and articulate. Revenge is tidy in the mind. But in the wash of grief and closeness, she had been softened by unplanned things. The shape of Jordan's laugh, the way his hand fit between her ribs when he slept, the way he recited the names of trees she'd told him about, as if collecting them for a map. To be returned, whatever that might mean, was to be taken from the warmth she had come to crave. "If I go back," she asked, "will he be left safe?" The mother's eyes were not unkind. They were made of rock and seen through centuries. "No law guarantees safety for those you love," she said. "But debts must be paid." "You can take me instead," Diana whispered. "Take me for yours and let him go." The mother's smile was small and without generosity. "To offer yourself is to break an order," she said. "It will be recorded. It will be remembered. But the ledger is not a ledger of sentiment. It is of balance. If you offer yourself, the balance will be different. That is all." Diana bent her head. For a wild, reckless moment, Jordan imagined her returning to the river and never returning as she had been. He imagined the lodestone of her absence pulling ruin through him. He also imagined, less plausibly, a ledger that could be fooled by a willing body. "You have 2 days," the mother said, and the words were not a sentence so much as a line drawn in wet clay. "Decide, or the ledger will decide for you." Between the mother's departure and Diana's return to town, Jordan went about his days with the speed and aim of someone who knows a clock is set to blow up. He tried to find the remaining men from that night. David, who filmed. Marcus had already been claimed by the ledger, but David avoided him like a man avoiding an accusation he could not bear. They met on the edge of the market, where spices made the air taste of citrus and iron. "I was there," David said immediately when Jordan approached. His voice was a paper torn and glued back together. "I filmed it. I still have the footage." Jordan's hands went cold. "Give it to me," he said, and perhaps it was the only order his guilt could mount. David handed him the phone. In the shaky, drunken light of that night, Jordan saw himself, floodlit in a circle of men, leaning into spectacle. He saw the snake coil. He saw Kelvin strike first. He saw himself laugh, and then urinate like an animal marking territory. For the first time he watched with a sober clarity how terrible it looked. Predators in a circle. He watched the second watcher in the grass flick its head, almost invisible. And then the sequence he already knew. The panic, the boot, the dull stillness when something very alive became a thing. When he finished, Jordan closed his hand around the phone as if it might dissolve. I did it," he said to David, and the words were loose in his mouth in a way that made him want to hide. "What are you going to do?" David asked, and that was the honest, small question. In that moment, Jordan heard his own cowardice and his own courage. He could run like a man who avoids lightning, or he could stand like a man who had been struck and refused to be erased. "I don't know," he said. He did not tell David about the 2 dots on his neck that had arrived like a verdict. He did not tell him how Diana had slept like an accusation against the dark. He did not tell him that Diana had been given 3 days. Some things he kept because they were raw and private. Some things because telling them gave them weight they did not need to have. Diana prepared in ways that did not look like preparing. She mended his shirts so the seams lay flat like apologies. She sharpened a kitchen knife and then hid it in a drawer. She cut a piece of herself, small and careful, from the hem of her dress and tacked it into Jordan's jacket pocket. A glassy sliver that would catch the sun and remind him she had not been wholly river. At odd hours she walked the house and touched every hinge and wall as if she could find a weakness in the ledger by mapping human surfaces. On the day before the final night, Jordan asked her once, in a voice unclipped by pretension, if she could remember a childhood birthday. She smiled, and for a moment she was only a woman. "I had a blue bead, like a marble. My mother kept it on a string and told me that each bead is a life." She put her hand to his cheek, and for a second the world narrowed to that touch. "If I go," she said softly, "remember the blue bead." They spent the day as if it were a small theft from the future. They walked to the market and took 2 oranges whose scent they ate like a contraband. They sat at the sea wall while the town went about its business. The ocean made its indifferent music. Jordan told her things he had not said in the waking night, about leaving school to help his mother, about being 19 and believing a road belonged to boys. Diana laughed at a joke that was not funny, and then watched him with the terror and tenderness of someone cataloging a loss. They made love in the way of 2 people who have had their nights shortened by an approaching storm. Careful, urgent, quiet. That night the town felt like a held breath. The moon draped itself over the mangroves, and the mother waited with a gravity that made roots look like hands. Jordan walked with Diana to the riverbank, his hand in hers, and it was a miracle in itself that both were there, the avenger and the man who had invoked the ledger's tally. Behind them, someone had left a lamp that made the mud gleam like the underside of a fish. The mother sat at the center of the ring with the same immovable composure. Around her were the figures Jordan had begun to sense in the periphery. Other river peoples with the same patient faces, their mouths shut like shells. When Diana stepped forward, the mother did not look surprised. She had always known the shape of what would come. "You offered yourself," the mother said. "I offered myself," Diana replied. Her voice did not tremble. "You do not give what is not yours to give," the mother said. "Or perhaps you would keep a part of him by paying in bone." "Let me go," Diana said. The urgency in her voice was not for her own survival, it was for Jordan's life. Let him go home. Take me. I will leave the soft world. You will be returned, the mother said. The words seemed to close around Diana like a hand. Returned and bound. You will know the river for what it is again. You will be hollowed, so the ledger will close. Jordan wanted to step forward then and pull the mother apart with words. He wanted to say he would take the ledger upon himself, that he would walk into water and be counted, that he would pay for the things he had done. He wanted to do anything but watch Diana walk into the mouth of a law he could not touch. You can take me instead, he said, blundering forward. Take me. I started it. I will pay. The mother's gaze slid over him like wind over a table. You ask that he be returned in the place of the coin, she said to Diana. You attempt to bargain with a neatness that would fool a child. I am no child, Diana said. She had grown in the space between them into something that belonged to both the river and the house. But I will not take his life. If you do not take his life, the mother said, and if you do not pay what the ledger demands, the ledger will not take him alone. Her words were slow and meticulous. It will take you. In places worse than water, things can be kept alive for a long unkindness. You understand. We do not only take life, we rearrange it. Diana's fingers found Jordan's and squeezed. He heard the small human sound from her chest that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. I will accept the return, she said. The mother turned her face downward and began to chant in a language that felt like river rocks rubbing together. The words were low and precise. Diana knelt and began to echo them, but then she stopped and looked up at Jordan. Promise me, she said, and the words were both a plea and an ultimatum. Promise me you will live. I promise, Jordan said, though his promise felt flimsy. How do you promise to survive a world that has turned on a hinge? The ritual rustled like silk. The mother reached into the ring and produced something small and old. 2 pebbles joined by a bit of cord, each pebble painted black on one face. She opened her mouth and spoke the name of the ledger in a sound that made Jordan's hair prick. The mother then touched each pebble to Diana's throat, not with force but with the finality of a surgeon's knife. Diana looked at Jordan. There was a softness there that was almost unbearable. If I am returned, she said, remember, please, the blue bead. You will not be alone, Jordan whispered. He thought of all he had to say, all he would be left with. A pocket with a glassy sliver, a jacket with a sewn-in hem, a window that would hold the shape of her. He thought of waking the morning after and finding empty bedclothes. Diana nodded once. She folded her hands and offered herself to whatever law the river demanded. The mother began to speak again, and the water responded, as if the river had been waiting for the ledger to be balanced in this particular arrangement for years. Jordan tried to hold her hand as she stood, but when he squeezed, her fingers were like cold glass. He felt the texture of her skin change under his palm, no longer just warm flesh, but the faint hardness of scale beneath, like a map being rewritten. She stepped forward, into the thin, sucking mud at the river's edge. Live, she told him, and the word was an ember placed inside his chest. He lunged. The mud took his boot. He grabbed at her as if he could anchor her with his hands. For one raw instant her eyes were human, bright and terrified, and full of the small, impossible tenderness that had made him love her. She reached for his face and thumbed the salt of his cheek as if she were etching memory there. Don't follow, she said. I'll not let them take you, he said, voice breaking with a man's redundancy. You can't keep me. Her mouth moved. Keep them. Keep the town. Live bigger than I ever taught you to. The mother's chant rose and folded around them like a net. The river lipped at Diana's knees. Something like a silver thinness began to crawl up her shins, and she looked down, startled, like a person catching their reflection in a puddle and seeing another face. Jordan tried to pull her back and found his fingers slipping. The mud was greedy. Diana's hair, which had been clipped and tidy in the house, now hung wet and heavy against her neck. The light caught on it and made it look like a spill of oil. She smiled at him, a small, brave thing. and then the skin on her ankle flickered. For the first time he saw scales climb, small and bright, ghost laces along the shin. The sight was terrible in its beauty. Not a monstrous change, but a literal folding of the self into another geometry. Diana closed her eyes. "Remember the blue bead," she said. "Remember that I—" The water took her knees and then her hips. Jordan's hands were still on her, but the mud had him by the shoe. His weight could not counter the river's greedy patience. He slid, cursed, and found himself on his knees beside her, the world narrowing to the ring of light and the sound of the mother's voice. Diana's face tilted to him, and in that tilt there was no longer a thing to bargain with. Her eyes looked like two small knights. She whispered his name once, and then, because the river would not be begged, she let go of his hands. He reached and found only wet sleeve and air. The mother's chant folded shut. The water closed over Diana's shoulders, and the reflection of the moon shattered in a dozen small mirrors. Jordan pushed down into the mud until the cold rose into his chest, and then frightened hands, other townfolk who had come, gripped him and hauled him back to the light. When he opened his eyes again on the bank, the world had rearranged itself. The mother sat aside, her cloak clinging with river water and something between her expression of assessment and something like an unreadable patience. The other river folk had retreated into darkness like a tide going out. The river itself seemed and flowed on, as if nothing but a small change had passed through. Diana was not on the bank. Jordan crawled forward until he could smell the mud and the salt, and the thing that had been her. He dug his hands into the place where she had been standing, and found only the glint of a single glassy flake stuck to the mud, small as a shard and catching the moonlight like a locket. He held it until his fingers numbed. When they buried her, if bury is the right word for something returned, no one told him that they had made a grave. There was an absence where she had once been, and absence has its own gravity. The pastor spoke with a broken throat about forgiveness and penance. Others said less and stared at Jordan as if he were the center of the storm, whose winds still moved across the town. On his pillow that night, Jordan found the blue bead Diana had once mentioned. It had been placed there by someone. He did not know whether the mother had left it, or if Diana had thought to press it into his pocket before her surrender. He held it like contraband against his ribs and felt the small, hard weight of it. He slept like a person half alive. In the days that followed, life moved, but not in its old cadence. The town spoke of the river with a new softness. The police closed certain cases with somber nods, and the pastor asked people to hold vigils for the living. The two dots did not appear on Jordan. The ledger had been paid in a strange human way, by the sacrifice of a thing who had loved him enough to be returned. At night, sometimes, when the moon was full and the river breathed silver, Jordan thought he heard a sound like a tongue on the back of a throat. He would find a flake of glassy scale tucked into the cuff of a shirt or sewn into the hemline of a towel. Once he saw, in the sheen of the water, a shape that might have been her. Distant, impossible, turning back as if to look at a man who had been given time and training, and wanted now, with a terrible earnestness, to live. He lived. Not because the ledger had failed, or because revenge had been cheated, but because love had been willing to feed itself to the river. Jordan carried the memory of Diana like an ache and a compass. He kept the blue bead in a pocket above his heart, and every morning tuned,